And we're back. Okay, so um, space, and I'm going from page 13, chapter in space, chapter 3. Space is how do you talk about space? So space has to be recreated, a representation of the real world space has to be recreated on the screen world space, because the screen is flat, two-dimensional. We can only measure the height, right, from here to here, and the width from there to there, right? That's our screen world, and it's flat. It's two-dimensional, height, width. What it doesn't capture, or what has to be represented or recreated, is that third dimension, that dimension of depth, where an object like this pen, right, gets closer and closer and closer to the camera. How does that motion, how does that interpret or get recreated? What comes into play when that happens? That depth. Okay? So in space, in terms of space, that's what we're dissecting now, right? The space in front of the camera. And he starts us off with deep space. And this is the part one of the primary subcomponents. I'm going to read something to you. The real world that we live in is three-dimensional, having height, width, and depth. But the physical nature of the screen is strictly two-dimensional. Movie, television, and computer screens are flat flat surfaces that can be measured in height and width, but basically speaking have no depth. The challenge is to portray our three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional screen surface and have the result appear believable, three-dimensional. A viewer should watch the screen's two-dimensional picture and accept the images as realistic representations of our three-dimensional world. So the viewer has to accept what I'm offering them visually as a perfect representation of what is in the front of the camera right now. Does that make sense? So they have to accept that, and if they don't accept that, then they won't accept the movie. It's like a logical leap that we take in our minds. That, oh yeah, I'm watching the professor right now in his room giving a lecture on the screen. No, you're not. You're watching the screen. Okay, you're watching a flat representation of me being recreated on your screen. Okay. So let's talk about recreating that space. And there are several types of spaces, right? There's deep space, flat space, ambiguous space. There's open space, right? We're gonna talk about each one of these different types of spaces right now. Okay, the first one is deep space. Okay, now let's talk about what makes up deep space. And I may shut the camera off and take it outside just to give you guys a better example of something as far as like deep space. All right. But deep space is the illusion of the three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. It's possible to give an audience the visual experience of seeing a three-dimensional space, even though all the depth is illusionary. There is never real depth because the screen upon which the picture exists is only two-dimensional. The audience believes they see depth on a two-dimensional screen because of the depth cues. Well, here are the depth cues. Okay? 1. The deep space depth cue is a two-dimensional surface and is created and controlled using the depth tools. Depth cues are visual elements that create the illusion of depth. We're talking depth here, like in and out, away from the camera. Okay. Perspective. Remember I mentioned that before. Perspective. The most important depth cue is perspective. When creating illusionary depth for a flat screen, it is essential to know how to recognize perspective in the real world. Next, he shows us this flat picture like this example, perspective. Imagine if this were a wall, right? If this were a wall and it's sitting there, it's flat. It's a frontal flat plane. A flat frontal plane. It's just sitting right there flat in front of us. Okay? The plane's top lines and the bottom lines are all parallel. These lines here, the top, and the lines on the bottom, if they continued on and on and on and on, they would never touch. They're parallel. Okay? That's flat. This is a flat frontal plane. Now, here's a real world example of a flat frontal plane. See that image right there? That is also a flat frontal plane. If you look at all the lines and how they go off to the left and to the right, they're parallel. They will never touch. Okay? So now I'm going to show you an example where happens when we add what's called perspective. Okay? And perspective from the camera itself. The way the camera is situated. I can take it from, like, right now to show that flat frontal plane, the camera was right there in front of the wall. Now if I take it and move it off to the side and shoot that same wall, this is what it looks like. And this is what we call perspective. Boom. Can you guys see that? That's perspective. Now, look at how the top and the bottom lines, they look as if they continued on the horizon. If these lines, where is it? If this line and this line continued on, they would meet in the horizon right here. And here's the real world example of that. All right. Now, let's talk about those lines meeting again. If those lines kept going, and these are not real lines, these are imaginary lines that we see in our mind's eye. If they kept going, if this line right here and this line right here kept going, they would meet right here at this point. That point is what we call a vanishing point. Okay? That's one of the terms you have to know, a vanishing point. Our eyes are automatically drawn to vanishing points, and they can also occur off screen. Right? When we see a vanishing point, we know that that's 1 point perspective. One single vanishing point means 1 point perspective. Okay? Here's another example of 1 point perspective and a vanishing point. We know these are railroad tracks. They don't touch, yet off here on the horizon, they appear to touch. That's called the vanishing point right there on the horizon where I'm pointing to with the pen. Okay? Our eyes are drawn to vanishing points. Whenever we have a vanishing point on screen, our eyes are going to be drawn there. A very powerful thing. Okay, so if we have one vanishing point, that's 1 point perspective. Now we can have 2 vanishing points, and that's going to give us 2 point perspective. And here's an example of 2 point perspective. And in this case, the vanishing points are happening off screen, but you can see how they are skewed. So the lines kind of, if they keep going, they're going to meet right up in here somewhere. And then the other one is this one going this way, and they're going to meet this way right here. 2 point perspective. Here's the real world example of that 2 point perspective. Here's another example of two-point perspective. Okay, and this time the vanishing points are off to the side. Here, you have one here, and you have another one here. Two vanishing points. And here's the real-world perspective of that, a real-world application of that theory. You have a vanishing point here somewhere, and another one over here somewhere off screen, off camera. Two-point perspective. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, if it's possible to have 1 point and 2 point, yes, it's possible to have 3-point perspective. This is 3-point perspective. 1, 2, and 3. And here's another example of 3-point perspective. Okay. So in terms of the camera, where you place it and how you place it is going to determine if the perspective. If it's either flat frontal, off to the side for a 2-point, downward angled up for a 3-point, or whatever variation. But you have to be able to identify the perspective: 1 point, 2 point, and 3-point perspective. Now, for the sake of film theory, we refer to the actors as objects. Only in the context of film theory. On the real set, the actors are people. These are regular people, and you refer to them as people, and you treat them as people. Okay, I'm just talking in terms of film theory. We refer to them as objects because we're going to refer to everything on the screen as object. Right now, I'm on the screen, your screen, so I'm an object. This laptop is an object. This mouse is an object, right? Everything is an object on the screen. Okay? Audiences are normally drawn to vanishing points, and where we place objects in relationship to those vanishing points can create a certain mood or accomplish something. Here's 3 examples that he gives us where we have the vanishing point right here in the center, right? And he gives us an example where we have an object or an actor placed off to the side of the vanishing point. Maybe they can deliver a line from here, where now we have this tension of our eyes are drawn here, but we're forced to look here. Or here's another one, where the actor is right here, dead in the center. Again, there is no right, there is no wrong. These are just facts that you're going to have to learn how to identify. Okay? The next thing I want to talk about, and the last thing I want to talk about, is size difference. As objects are closer to the camera appear larger, objects that are farther away appear smaller. I'm sorry, objects of known size. So these 3 men right here, we know their sizes, yet this guy right here appears larger on the screen than this guy right here. Okay? So now we have to bring in the terms foreground, midground, and background, which would explain the size difference. And we see that size difference as a cue, a depth cue. All right? Objects in the foreground appear larger. Objects in the background appear smaller. That's a depth. The brain translates that size difference into depth. It figures if both objects are the known size, and in real life, when I'm closer to an object, that object in real life appears larger, right? So on the screen world, the same rules must apply. Objects that are farther away, in your turn, objects that are closest to the camera appear larger. Objects that are farthest away appear smaller. Okay? Size difference. Foreground, midground, background. Alright, I'm going to stop right there. And I'm going to start a whole nother video for object movement. Good luck. Post your questions in the discussion and I'll answer them. All right.